The United Kingdom takes the floor.
Positive steps by Pakistan, including a National Commission for Human Rights, National Action Plan and laws on the rights of women and minorities. We remain deeply concerned about Pakistan's overall human rights record. This includes limits on freedoms of expression and religion or belief, particularly for the Christian and Ahmadiyya Muslim communities, as well as the increased misuse of terror legislation to portray religious publications of minority communities as hate material. We recommend 1. Strengthen the protection of minorities by having a fully inclusive electoral roll without discrimination or religious bias, and by establishing an independent National Commission for Minorities from all faith communities, who should appoint their own representatives. 2. Implement fully the National Strategic Framework against trafficking in persons and human smuggling, ensuring adequate human and financial resource. 3. Set a clear timeline for the review of legislation carrying the death penalty, with the aim of limiting the scope of crimes to which it applies. Thank you, Mr. President.
The United States of America has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United States welcomes the Pakistani delegation to the UPR Working Group. We recommend that Pakistan, 1, repeal blasphemy laws and restrictions and end their use against Ahmadi Muslims and others, and grant the visit of the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression. 2, pass an anti-trafficking law that prohibits and penalizes all forms of human trafficking. And 3, track and report the investigation and prosecution of security forces who commit human rights violations and abuses. We commend Pakistan for passing the Hindu Marriage Act, which allows, for the first time, members of the Hindu community to register their marriages. We note increased investigations, prosecutions, and convictions for sex trafficking, and passage of anti-honor killing and anti-rape laws, which, if enforced, should reduce violence against women and girls. We note with concern, however, the enforcement of blasphemy laws and restrictions against Ahmadi Muslims, and the use of these laws to intimidate political opponents and settle personal disputes. Finally, we are concerned about the international NGO policy restricting operations of nonviolent offenses. Thank you, Mr. President.
Afghanistan has the floor.
President, Afghanistan warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, His Excellency Minister Khwaja Mohammad Asif, to the UPR Working Group, and notes the efforts made by Pakistan in promotion and protection of human rights. My delegation wishes to propose the following recommendations. 1. To ensure all refugees within the territory of Pakistan enjoy their basic human rights and are protected from arbitrary arrest, humiliation and enforced expulsion. 2. To ensure that madrasas within the territory of Pakistan operate in line with the human rights obligations of Pakistan. 3. To ratify the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and members of their families, the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, and the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. 4. To extend a standing invitation to special procedures mandate holders. Terrorism is the deadliest phenomenon of our era. Our world, and particularly our region, have seriously suffered from terrorism and terrorist networks. Afghanistan firmly believes that any policy or action to combat terrorism must not distinguish terrorism into good and bad. My government calls for a sincere cooperation by Pakistan in line with the recent discussions, including the trilateral and quadrilateral counter-terrorism efforts in the region, and recommend a comprehensive response toward both terrorism and terrorists. Mr. President, finally, my delegation wishes all success to the distinguished delegations of Pakistan in this review. Thank you.
The Argentine Republic has the floor. Thank you, President. The Argentinian Republic welcomes the delegation of Pakistan and thanks it for the presentation of the report. We'd like to congratulate Pakistan on its ratification in November 2016 of the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child concerning the involvement of children in armed conflict. Argentina would like to recommend that the authorities take urgent measures to protect women and girls from gender discrimination, in particular by ensuring their access to education. Argentina respectfully recommends that greater efforts be made to investigate reports of discrimination, and that those who commit crimes against ethnic and religious minorities, such as the Hazars, Dalits, Christians, Hindus and Ahmadis, be brought to justice. Lastly, Argentina recommends that the authorities take the necessary measures to ratify the International Convention on Enforced Disappearance and recognise the committee's competence. Thank you very much. Australia has the floor.
Australia welcomes Pakistan's efforts since the last Universal Periodic Review to address violence against women and girls. Australia recommends Pakistan enact and enforce legislation to afford legal protections from violence and discrimination to all its citizens, including women, girls, the LGBTI community and religious minorities, including through effective prosecutions in accordance with the rule of law. Australia recommends Pakistan enact and enforce legislation that facilitates women's social, political and economic empowerment, including in relation to child marriage and forced conversion. Australia remains concerned by violence against human rights defenders and recommends Pakistan take steps to protect freedom of expression and online freedoms. Australia recommends Pakistan reinstitute its moratorium on the use of the death penalty as a first step towards complete abolition and accede to the second optional protocol of the ICCPR. Australia recommends Pakistan ensure due process is afforded to all persons accused of criminal offences as well as protection from public persecution.
Belgium has the floor. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. President. I welcome His Excellency Minister Asif and thank him for his presentation. Belgium wishes to recommend to Pakistan, first, to immediately repeal legislation that provides the possibility to impose the death penalty for freedom of speech-related cases, in particular Section 295C of the Penal Code, in order to ensure compliance with Article 6 and 19 of the ICCPR. Second, to set the legal minimum age to marry at 18 years for males and females in all provinces and ensure that the law is effectively enforced. And third, to adopt legislation that criminalizes domestic violence in all provinces and ensure, promote and facilitate the effective implementation of this legislation inter alia by providing training for law enforcement officers. Thank you, Mr. President.
Brazil has the floor.
Mr. Presidente, Brazil welcomes the delegation of Pakistan to the third cycle of the Universal Periodic Review and thanks it for the comprehensive report. We'd like to present the following two recommendations. 1. Redouble efforts to enforce laws criminalizing gender-biased violence, such as the recently adopted anti-rape law and anti-honor killing law. 2. Reinstate the moratorium on the death penalty and consider abolishing capital punishment. Brazil commends Pakistan for establishing the Ministry of Human Rights and the National Commission for Human Rights, as well as for adopting a National Human Rights Action Plan in 2016. We encourage its government to take further steps in order to provide the necessary means to achieve their goals. We also congratulate Pakistan for the recent positive developments on the rights of transgender persons. The Brazilian government, however, would like to express its concern about reports on human rights violations related to religious intolerance. Thank you, Mr. President.
Canada has the floor.
President. Canada thanks Pakistan's delegation led by Minister Asif and for its presentation today. We welcome its recent accession to the Hague Convention on Child Abduction. Today, Canada recommends that Pakistan, 1. Implement measures to prevent violence, persecution and discrimination on the basis of religion, and in particular, prevent the misuse of blasphemy laws by requiring all cases to undergo prior judicial review before charges may proceed. 2. Fully staff and fund the NHRI institutions outlined in its Action Plan for Human Rights in order to better collect and analyze disaggregated data in support of laws, policies, and safeguards related to women and girls. 3. Bring to justice anyone who threatens, abducts, or attacks human rights defenders, journalists, bloggers, or others who work to promote democracy. And 4. Legislate a specific definition of torture as recommended by the CAT in June 17. Canada is concerned about reports of forced conversions, and I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Denmark warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation from Pakistan. Protecting the sexual and reproductive health and rights of women and girls is key to ensure their physical and mental well-being, safety and health. Child early and forced marriage of especially young girls is unfortunate, often linked with sexual exploitation and abuse. Denmark recommends Pakistan to amend the Child Marriage Restraint Act to include an equal minimum age of marriage of 18 years for all individuals. Protecting the rights of religious minorities is crucial to a fair and just society. Denmark recommends Pakistan to amend Chapter 15 of the Penal Code to ensure protection of minorities of all religions and beliefs. Finally, Denmark recommends Pakistan to ratify the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. The Convention Against Torture initiative stands ready to explore avenues to assist Pakistan on this issue if deemed helpful. I thank you.
Ethiopia has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ethiopia welcomed the delegation of Pakistan to the 20th session of the UPR Working Group and thank the delegation for the national report and the oral updates today. We commend Pakistan for its efforts exerted in implementing the recommendations received during the second cycle of UPR and the developments in the area of legal, policy and institutions. We particularly note with appreciation Vision 2025 as a foundation for change and transformation and the launch of National Action Plan on Human Rights in 2016. The activities in climate change, health, women's rights, among others, are also commendable. Ethiopia therefore recommends Pakistan, 1, to strengthen awareness raising and implementation of the National Action Plan on Human Rights. 2nd, identify gaps for further protection and harmonization of vulnerable groups, including religious minorities. Finally, Ethiopia wishes all the best to the delegation of Pakistan in its engagement with the Human Rights Council. I thank you.
France has the floor.
Thank you very much, sir. We would like to thank His Excellency Mr. Asif and the entire Pakistani delegation for the presentation of their report. France welcomes the progress made in human rights in Pakistan, in particular the adoption of a human rights action plan and the establishment of a national commission for human rights. A number of obstacles nonetheless limit the scope of this progress, while Pakistan itself has been elected to the Human Rights Council. In this context, France would make the following recommendations to Pakistan. First, that it establish a moratorium on the death penalty. Second, review procedures applicable for the law on blasphemy to contain abuses, continue the implementation of its law to protect women, continue the adoption of measures to protect journalists and human rights authors and ensure that those responsible for violence against them are brought to trial. 5, step up the adoption of laws to protection of LGBT persons, in particular the Transgender Protection of Rights Bill. 6, ratify the International Convention against Forced Disappearances. And 7, to take effective measures to protect persons belonging to minorities, in particular the Ahmadi community. Thank you.
Georgia has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Georgia welcomes the delegation of Pakistan and thanks the head of delegation for the presentation. Georgia recognizes the steps taken by Pakistan in addressing the recommendations from the second review. In this regard, we welcome the adoption of the Comprehensive National Action Plan on Human Rights and the ratification of the OP to the CRC on the involvement of children in armed conflict. While noting governments strive to establish an inclusive society, we encourage the government of Pakistan to accelerate its efforts with regard to combating hate crime and eliminating violence against minority groups. Georgia would like to recommend to the government of Pakistan: 1, to ratify the OP to the CRC on a communications procedure. 2, to strengthen measures with regard to elimination of violence and discrimination against persons belonging to religious minorities. And 3, step up efforts to ensure provision of free and quality primary and secondary education. We wish the delegation of Pakistan a successful UPR. I thank you.
Germany has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We warmly welcome the delegation of Pakistan to this UPR, and we recommend 1. Take measures to considerably reduce the number of stunted children and out-of-school children, and end child labor by developing indicators and a timeline for the implementation of the recent legislation against child labor. 2. Develop indicators and a timeline for the implementation of the recent legislation on women's rights and ratify the optional protocol to CEDAW. 3. Conduct an independent inquiry into all suspected cases of enforced disappearances of human rights defenders and hold accountable those responsible. 4. Reinstate the moratorium on executions and ban the death penalty for defendants who suffer from mental illness or were minors at the time of their alleged crimes. While Pakistan has achieved considerable progress, the fight against poverty remains a huge challenge. In spite of some positive examples of new legislation, notably the Punjab Protection of Women Against Violence Act, women, children and religious minorities continue to suffer from widespread discrimination and violence. The lifting of the moratorium on the death penalty, followed by unprecedented numbers of executions, is a significant step backwards. We wish you a successful UPR. Thank you, Mr. President.
La Santa Sede.
The Holy See has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The delegation of the Holy See welcomes the delegation of Pakistan during the presentation of its national report and appreciates the efforts made by the authorities of Pakistan in promoting and protecting human rights in the country. Despite the steps taken by the government in recent years, multiple attacks on religious minorities have been registered. My delegation wishes to present the following recommendations: to increase its efforts to improve the education system as a tool to enhance peaceful coexistence in the country, to consider repealing the blasphemy law or at least amending it to protect persons from eventual abuses or false accusations, and to moderate the penalties, to continue its efforts for the improvement of the protection of human rights, especially by eliminating discrimination based on sex, race, caste and religion. Thank you, Mr. President.
India has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We welcome the delegation of Pakistan. We recommend the government of Pakistan following. 1. To provide freedom to the people of Pakistan occupied Kashmir, the people, by ending its illegal and forcible occupation. 2. To dismantle special terrorist zones, safe havens and sanctuaries and take verifiable actions including on terror financing. 3. To bar military courts from trying civilians and allow their monitoring by international observers and human rights organizations. 4. To allow due legal processes and judicial review by the Supreme Courts and by High Courts and Supreme Court for cases tried by military courts. 5. To fulfill international obligations under ICCPR and VCCR, including consular access for foreign nationals without discrimination. 6. To end harassment of minorities and place procedural and institutional safeguards to prevent misuse of blasphemy law. 7. To end forced conversions and marriages of minorities, including Hindu, Sikh and Christian women, and prosecute all cases. 8. To stop targeting political dissidents and legitimate criticism in Sindh, Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. The full statement along with the recommendations is available on UPR Extranet. Thank you, Mr. President.
Italy has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We welcome the distinguished delegation of Pakistan and thank them for their national report and presentation. Italy congratulates Pakistan for its election at the Human Rights Council and welcomes, since the second cycle of the UPR, the launch of a national action plan on human rights and the promotion of interfaith dialogue. Italy recommends Pakistan to consider to re-establish a moratorium on executions with the view to abolishing the death penalty. Guarantee freedom of religion or belief by considering to decriminalize blasphemy and adopt measures to protect the rights of persons belonging to religious minorities. Strengthen efforts to prevent and combat all forms of discrimination and violence against women and children by means of reinforcing the relevant legal framework, running awareness campaigns and ensuring that perpetrators are brought to justice and victims receive appropriate help. Italy wishes Pakistan a successful UPR. Thank you.
Países Bajos tiene la...
Netherlands has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands congratulates Pakistan on its recent election to the Human Rights Council as a testimony to Pakistan's commitment to human rights promotion. The Netherlands remains concerned about violence and discrimination against religious, ethnic and gender-based minorities. We recommend Pakistan, 1, to adopt and implement legal and practical measures to ensure the protection of religious minorities, including Christians, Ahmadis, Hindus and Sikhs, in line with the previous ICCPR concluding observations, recommendation 34. 2, to adopt effective measures to prevent and punish all forms of discrimination against minority groups by adding clear provisions to Articles 25 to 27 of the Constitution to ensure prohibition of discrimination on all grounds, including sexual orientation and gender identity, as well as by adding clear protection provisions in criminal laws concerning public assembly, obscenity and public nuisance. We thank Pakistan for its constructive engagement and wish Pakistan the very best for the third UPR cycle. Thank you, Mr. President.
Nueva Zelanda.
New Zealand has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and welcome to the delegation from Pakistan. New Zealand recommends Pakistan continue its efforts towards eradicating discrimination and violence against women and girls, including by the full implementation of the anti-rape and anti-honour killing laws, with thorough investigation and prosecution of all violations of those laws. We recommend Pakistan ensure the protection of the right to freedom of religion or belief, expression, association and peaceful assembly by decriminalising blasphemy and respecting, protecting and fulfilling the rights of all religious minorities, including the Ahmadi, Shia Muslims, Christians and Baha'i. New Zealand also wishes to recommend that Pakistan halt the use of the death penalty in all circumstances and take steps towards its abolition, including ratification of the second optional protocol to the ICCPR. Finally, New Zealand recommends that Pakistan ensure due process and full enforcement of laws to avoid extrajudicial, summary or arbitrary killings and arbitrary detentions, including adopting all necessary measures, including legal and judicial measures, in order to bring an end to impunity and to prevent the recurrence of such activities. Thank you, Mr. President.
The Constitution of Pakistan provides for freedom of religious or belief under Article 20, 21, 22, 26 and 27 of our Constitution. Minorities are free to profess their religion and visit their places of worship. The government had abandoned all earlier references to the term scheduled caste from the pre-partition inhabited documentation. There is neither of de facto or de jure scheduled caste system in Pakistan. The state constitution legislation prohibits any discrimination on the basis of caste, color, creed and religion. Mr. President, Pakistan's efforts against the propagating of hate speech in the Council are well known, and we have been leading the global efforts in combating intolerance and hate speech. Nationally, there are many legislative provisions of prohibits hate speech.